Hey Adam, do you have any fond childhood memories of the zoo? Like before we were old enough to realize that putting a gorilla in Scarborough might raise a few ethical questions?
Childhood me loved the zoo and still remembers it fondly. It's like Jurassic Park, but with more hot dogs and fewer fatalities.
Exactly. Back then, most of us weren't really exposed to the downsides of zoos. No documentaries about animal trauma, no awkward conversations about elephant arthritis, just a field trip, a soggy sandwich, and if you were lucky, a monkey that threw something inappropriate at your teacher.
At no point did any monkeys throw anything at any of my teachers, so I really feel like I missed out on something there.
For me, when I went to the zoo, I loved the bald eagle. I was obsessed. I had posters, trading cards. Maybe like them, they were foreshadowing my future hair situation. The zoo was one of the only places to see a bald eagle up close.
I don't know if that's true. These days, there's probably a few falconers around if you want to take up a nice medieval pastime.
But when I saw it, it was kind of weird because it had a chain on its foot. Like, here's this majestic, soaring icon, and it's literally shackled to a tree stump in East Scarborough. It's like finding out that Superman works part-time at a Loblaws deli counter. It always felt kind of odd.
I was not so enlightened as you. I was just thinking, cool, make it fly.
But seeing that raises a good question. What exactly is a zoo in Toronto's eyes? Is it an animal sanctuary, a school field trip factory, a conservation lab, a theme park with fewer churros?
Yes, and also no.
Because today, on Muddy York, we're swinging through the treetops of Toronto Zoo history, from the Riverdale farm in the early days to the high-minded, ethically ambitious, and chaotically managed mega zoo we know today.
Along the way, we'll see just how much the Toronto Zoo reflects the city that built it. Big dreams, half funding, and eternal compromise.
The animals might change, but the civic dysfunction is forever. I'm Grayson Miller.
And I'm Adam Weiser.
And this is Muddy York. Before the Toronto Zoo in Scarborough became the sprawling 700-plus acre monument to good intentions and half-finished dreams, the city's first attempt at a zoo was much closer to downtown. We're talking Cabbagetown, specifically Riverdale Park, where Riverdale Farm is today. In the late 1800s, Toronto decided that right next to the Don Jail would be the perfect place for both a public park and eventually a collection of exotic animals, because nothing says a family outing like lions roaring in the background while prisoners shovel manure into landfill. Riverdale Zoo officially got going in 1888 when Alderman Daniel Lamb donated a few deer to the city and then talked his well-connected friends into donating more animals. We couldn't find out any information as to why or how these well-connected friends owned various exotic animals, but pretty soon the place was a full-on menagerie. Pheasants, monkeys, a Siberian bear, a camel, a dromedary, lions, even a hippopotamus. By 1902, the zoo had an elephant named Princess Rita. She was taught to carry people around on her head, and at least once was paraded down Winchester Street like it was totally normal to have pachyderms mixing with Victorian carriages and streetcars. For Rita, the people came in droves. When Rita the elephant and the lions were first put on display, the Toronto Railway Company reported hauling 20,000 visitors up to the Riverdale Zoo in a single weekend. To put that in perspective, that's more people than any night cheering on our Leafs or Raptors. For a city still finding its cultural footing, this was a spectacle. The zoo now had its own architectural showpiece too, the Donnybrook. It was a two-story Moorish-style building with arches and domes that looked like it had been dropped in from a Spanish postcard. More than just a fancy facade, the Donnybrook was a hub of the zoo grounds, a gathering place, a symbol of civic pride, and a visual reminder that Riverdale wasn't just a park with cages. It was Toronto's first real attempt at a zoological institution.
The Donnybrook wasn't just an odd little building. It set the tone for what Riverdale Zoo would become. Part curiosity show, part civic landmark, part accident waiting to happen. According to legend, during construction, a hippo wandered onto the wet cement and sat down, leaving a crater in the floor. That kind of slapstick energy carried through the zoo's history. The buffalo once cornered a group of workers and forced them up trees for half an hour. A pelican lost part of its beak to a wolf. and a local vet famously grafted part of a duck's bill on with horsehair. So yes, the bird survived. Toronto pulled off Frankenstein dentistry for pelicans years before the city ever had universal health care. Then there was the sea lion incident. Neighbors complained about its morning bellows, and the superintendent actually proposed cutting its vocal cords. Thankfully, the Humane Society stepped in before that happened, and they simply moved it to a different part of the grounds. But in true Toronto fashion, a man was later fined $5 for standing outside the cage and imitating the missing sound just to trick visitors. It's not entirely clear what he expected to get out of that, but these are the things that happen in a zoo. All of this makes Riverdale sound like a circus, and in many ways it was. Conditions were grim even by the standards of the time. Animals were crammed into dark cages, chained in pens, or shoved into enclosures with little shelter from the cold. Radiators were tossed in during the winter as if that solved the problem. Visitors handed monkeys cigars and ice cream, children tormented an elk until it killed its mate, and yet people kept coming. For 75 years, Riverdale Zoo was a civic institution. It was beloved, even if it was profoundly bleak for some of the creatures inside.
And that's the paradox of Riverdale Zoo. It was wildly popular, it was part of family life, and it was also completely out of step with any kind of humane animal care. By the 1960s, the cages were hopelessly outdated. The Humane Society was vocal, and the city finally admitted the whole operation needed to be replaced. In 1966, 11 citizens met at City Hall to form the Metropolitan Toronto Zoological Society. They wanted something bigger, something modern, something that would stop making Toronto look like it was running a sideshow act instead of a serious zoological park.
That's when Hugh Crothers walked onto the scene. Crothers wasn't some eccentric animal collector or a politician chasing headlines. He was a businessman. President of Crothers Limited, a Caterpillar tractor company. That's quite a name. The kind of person who built big things and expected them to last. In 1963, he decided that Toronto Zoo wasn't just outdated, it was embarrassing. His idea was simple: stop thinking small, something Toronto isn't always great at. Toronto needed a world-class zoo that could stand beside London or San Diego. Not rows of cages, but naturalistic landscapes. Not curiosities behind bars, but animals living in habitats that resembled their homes in the wild. Crothers did more than talk about it. He organized. He pulled together citizens, formed the Metropolitan Toronto Zoological Society, and lobbied City Hall until the plan had momentum. And against all odds, in a city famous for second-guessing itself, it worked. By 1967, Council had approved a new site in the Rouge Valley. Not crammed into downtown, not tucked next to a jail. This would be hundreds of acres of open land with room for something completely different.
And that's the genius of Crothers' vision. He wasn't just talking about scale, he was talking about philosophy. Imagine a zoo arranged not by species or spectacle, but by geography. Africa savannas, Asian forests, Canadian wilderness. Visitors wouldn't just stare through the bars, they'd move through environments, seeing animals in spaces that echoed their natural homes. Today it feels obvious, but in the 1960s, this was revolutionary. At a time when Toronto still had elephants chained by the legs and lions being hand-fed cod liver oil, Crothers was saying, enough, let's do better. And although the very idea of housing wild animals has always been debated and often criticized, Crothers was successful in his vision. By 1970, construction in the Rouge Valley was underway. Less than a decade after he first floated the idea, the Metropolitan Toronto Zoo opened its gates in 1974. It was not just a bigger zoo, it was a statement. Toronto could finally shake off the image of a shabby sideshow in Riverdale and step onto the world stage with something that looked modern, ethical, and immersive by the standards of the day.
When the Metropolitan Toronto Zoo opened its gates in August of '74, it was more than just a ribbon cutting. It was a statement. Toronto had finally left behind the cramped cages of Riverdale and stepped into the age of modern zoos. At 710 acres, it was one of the largest in the world. And right from the beginning, it had features most other zoos hadn't even considered. There was a full-time staff nutritionist to monitor animal diets, a volunteer program to help with operations, and a proper education branch to teach school groups and the public about conservation. Even in those early years, it wanted to be more than an amusement park for animals. It wanted to be taken seriously. And almost immediately, it started making headlines. The first baby born at the zoo wasn't a lion or a giraffe, it was a zorilla, also known as a striped polecat. It's basically a skunk on steroids, and it was the first ever born in the Western Hemisphere. It sounds small, but for zoologists, it was proof that this wasn't just a pretty campus. It was a place where science and conservation could happen. That became the zoo's calling card. It wasn't just about showing animals, it was about keeping them alive and thriving in ways other institutions hadn't figured out yet.
And that ambition showed up in the visitor experience too. This wasn't Riverdale's row of cages. Animals were grouped by geography, as we mentioned. Africa, Eurasia, Indo-Malaya, the Americas. You weren't just looking at lions or monkeys, you were walking through a version of their ecosystems. It felt like a global safari tucked into Scarborough's Rouge Valley. For the 70s and 80s kids in Toronto, it was mind-blowing. You could step off a TTC bus and within minutes be face-to-face with an elephant, or watch orangutans swing in their habitat, or see wolves pacing through the Canadian domain. Without the internet, this was top-tier entertainment. And then there was the Domain ride. In 1976, the zoo opened what was essentially a monorail through the Canadian domain. Picture it, rubber tires gliding along elevated tracks, carrying visitors deep into the valley to see moose, bears, and bison in wide open spaces. It was futuristic, it was ambitious, and it was very Toronto. By which I mean it eventually broke down and was mothballed in 1994 after an accident and left to be reclaimed by the weeds. But at the time, it gave people this sense that the zoo wasn't just a collection of animals, it was a city unto itself, a place where you could travel without leaving Scarborough.
Through the late 70s and early 80s, the Toronto Zoo wasn't just expanding, it was proving itself on the world stage. Canada's first Grevy zebra was born here. A Grevy, for those of you who don't know, which I imagine is most of you, is a very large zebra, actually the largest of all equid species and the rarest of all zebras. Then came the first fur seal born in the country, even the first white rhino calf. These weren't just curiosities for the public. They were benchmarks that showed the zoo was capable of supporting complex, delicate species. Animals that were notoriously difficult to keep in captivity were now being raised successfully in Scarborough. By 1980, the zoo had already become one of Toronto's most visited attractions. Families came in droves, and behind the scenes, the staff were quietly building a reputation for professional, science-based animal care. That reputation grew in the 1980s when conservation became a central part of the mission. The Toronto Zoo joined global efforts to save species that were literally vanishing. One of the most dramatic cases was the black-footed ferret. It was a small, nocturnal predator from the North American prairie that had been declared extinct in the wild. When a tiny remnant population was discovered, the Toronto Zoo became one of the first institutions trusted to breed them in captivity. The goal was not just to keep them alive, but to send them back to the prairies, and it worked. Ferrets born in Toronto eventually helped re-establish wild populations in places like Saskatchewan and Wyoming. The same was true of the Puerto Rican crested toad. This was an animal with a tiny range on a Caribbean island, hammered by habitat loss and disease. Once again, Toronto became part of the breeding network that brought them back from the edge. Suddenly, the zoo was no longer just a local attraction. It was part of international rescue missions. That gave it a new credibility. The animals in Scarborough were not only drawing crowds, they were part of preventing extinctions, a shift that made the zoo as much about science and survival as it was about entertainment.
But if conservation was the brain of the zoo, spectacle was still at the heart. And nothing proved that more than in 1985 when Toronto got its first pair of giant pandas.
Panda bears, wow, they're so cool. They wear sunglasses and they eat bamboo.
Panda won't ever give you the blues. He'll give you Pandamania, Pandamania.
The arrival of the rare giant pandas from China seems well worth a 10-year campaign to bring the bears to Canada. Jacques Bourbeau reports.
We have two reports this evening, one from CFTO's Tim Weber and another from CFTO's Gail Smith, who traveled to Hong Kong to pick up the endangered animals.
Their names are Chuen Chuen and Ching Ching, and they arrived on CP Air's Orient Express last night from China. Nancy Ng was on board the flight.
To steal the hearts of Canadians. Tonight, why pandas make good ambassadors.
Two rare giant pandas are resting at the Metropolitan Toronto Zoo, exhausted after a 20-hour flight from China and a blitz of media attention.
For the first 3 months straight, the city went into full-blown panda mania. Crowds lined up for hours, sometimes looping around the parking lot. The Toronto Sun ran breathless updates about the pandas' diet and sleeping habits, while the Globe and Mail described them as the hottest ticket in town. Attendance shattered every record the zoo had ever set. Gift shops sold out of panda mugs, panda posters, even panda snow globes. CBC compared it to Beatlemania, only fluffier, quieter, and with more bamboo. The pandas set a precedent. The zoo would follow for decades blockbuster exhibits that turned animals into celebrities. And the hits kept on coming. Koalas arrived in '88 and returned for encores in the '90s and early 2000s. Golden snub-nosed monkeys drew headlines in 1986. Tasmanian devils, white lions, and eventually Komodo dragons all got their moment in the spotlight. Each new arrival brought a surge of attention and fresh waves of visitors. But it also revealed something about Toronto. We weren't just lining up to see animals, we were lining up for validation. We wanted to be the kind of city that got pandas and white rhinos. A zoo that could make international headlines, not just a sleepy menagerie tucked away in the corner of the city.
The zoo also leaned into design flair during this period. In 1987, the South American waterfall was rebranded as the Maya Temple Ruins. The animals didn't change much. You still had capybaras, jaguars, and spider monkeys. But now the backdrop was a set of faux stone walls and carved motifs meant to suggest a lost temple in the jungles of Scarborough, that is. It was part theme park, part museum, and maybe a little kitsch. The idea was to make a trip to the zoo feel immersive, as if visitors were stepping into another world rather than just walking past cages. That approach carried into the 90s as new exhibits arrived at a steady pace. The Malayan Woods Pavilion opened in 1993 with lush tropical theming. Sumatran tigers arrived the next year. Naked mole rats with their see-through tunnels and bizarre social lives became a surprise fan favorite in 1996. And in 1997, Komodo dragons made their debut. These were animals that looked like something out of prehistory, and the marketing leaned into it. They were billed as living dinosaurs, and they drew massive crowds. But beneath all the spectacle, there were cracks. In 1997, zoo workers went on strike for 9 weeks. The gates stayed open to the public, but the absence of staff exposed how much invisible work went into keeping the zoo running. Keepers, maintenance crews, and educators had been pushing for better job security and working conditions. Their strike was a reminder that behind the polished exhibits and blockbuster animals, this was still a workplace where resources could be stretched thin. That tension between grand ambition and practical limits would continue to define much of the zoo's history.
And then came 1998, the year of amalgamation. Overnight, 6 municipalities and Metro Toronto were stitched into a mega city. A lot of institutions were scrambling to redefine themselves in this new civic order, and the zoo was no exception. Metro Toronto Zoo became simply the Toronto Zoo, but the real headline that year was the opening of the new African Savannah, the largest expansion in the zoo's history. For the first time, visitors could walk into an enclosure that tried to recreate the sweeping scale of Africa itself. Giraffes moving across an open plain, lions lounging in the sun, zebras and rhinos sharing the landscape. It was the culmination of the vision that Hugh Carruthers had set out more than 3 decades earlier. Animals in spacious habitats grouped by geography and framed as part of a living ecosystem rather than a collection of curiosities. At the time Toronto was wrestling with its own identity, the city wanted to be seen as world-class, not just a regional capital. The African Savannah played directly into that ambition. It gave Scarborough its own civic landmark, one that could hold its own against the great zoos of San Diego, London, or Berlin. And for a moment, it felt like Toronto had pulled it off. Standing in the middle of Scarborough, looking out at the giraffes against the skylines, you could believe that the city had created something extraordinary. Of course, like so many other big dreams we have here, it was never fully finished. Always a little underfunded and often a work in progress. But in that moment, the African Savannah was Toronto at its most ambitious.
By the end of the 90s, the Toronto Zoo had become more than an attraction. It was an institution. It delivered scientific firsts, blockbuster exhibits, and a conservation mandate that gave it international weight. It was also expensive to run, complicated to manage, and always balancing on that fine Toronto line between ambition and compromise. But for the people who walked through its gates, it was magic. The new millennium hit the Toronto Zoo like a renovation spree with a purpose. In 2001, half of the Africa Pavilion was transformed into the gorilla rainforest. It wasn't just big, it was record-setting. The zoo built the world's largest indoor habitat for western lowland gorillas, a sprawling enclosure that finally let visitors see a family of gorillas in something that felt like their natural environment. This was a major shift away from the concrete pits and cages that people were used to. And right next to it, they unveiled a massive Lake Malawi cichlid tank. Now, I had to look this up because I honestly had no idea what a cichlid was. Turns out they're these brilliantly colored African freshwater fish, with hundreds of species living in Lake Malawi alone. They're like the neon parrots of the fish world. For once, the aquarium wasn't just an afterthought, it was a main attraction, showing off fish as stars in their own right, which unfortunately became a problem since the fish started getting a swelled head, started making demands. The zoo kept getting calls from their agent. These things happen sometimes.
Hey, they were a big fish in a small pond.
You gotta be kidding me.
The zoo started to lean into family-friendly programming. In 2002, Splash Island opened, an educational water play area where kids can learn about rivers and rainfall while getting completely drenched on hot summer days. Talk about fun. That was followed by an open-air amphitheater in 2003, which gave the zoo a proper stage for demonstration and performances. And then there was the Kid Zoo in 2004, where families could get hands-on with smaller animals. It was all part of a larger shift in philosophy. The zoo was becoming more than just a place to look at animals. It was a place to learn, a place to play, and a place for the whole family to spend time together.
The sequencing mattered. It showed the zoo leaning into family-friendly design without losing the science. Even when SARS gutted Toronto's tourist economy in 2003, locals kept the gates turning. Attendance bounced back, and then some in the years that followed. The push to improve carried into the next phase. In late 2006, the Australasia Pavilion went dark for a full overhaul. 2 years of construction later, visitors walked into a brand new Great Barrier Reef zone with a 7-meter community tank and a supporting cast of brown-banded bamboo sharks, damselfish, triggerfish, lionfish, anemones, moon jellies, and upsized seahorse displays. It was a dramatic replacement for what used to be called edge of night, a dimly lit section where the zoo kept nocturnal animals on a reversed day-night cycle so people could see them awake and moving. The old crepuscular gimmick gave way to something much splashier, and it sent a clear signal. The zoo could do spectacle without losing the plot. And in between, the summer of 2007 delivered Dinosaurs Alive. The exhibit featured 18 animated models, full-size skeleton replicas, and what was billed as the largest Tyrannosaurus Rex model in North America. This wasn't just a fossil in a glass case. It was a towering reconstruction that moved, roared, and loomed over visitors. More than 600,000 people came through before it closed that October. Because admission to the exhibit was included with a regular zoo ticket, the stampede of families never stopped. Next, the zoo turned its attention north. On August 21, 2007, the old polar bear, llama, Dall sheep, and Mara exhibits were shut down to make way for a bold new project, the Tundra Trek. It was conceived as a showcase for Arctic and subarctic wildlife, a Canadian landscape built right in Scarborough. 2 years later, in 2009, it opened as a 10-acre zone featuring polar bears, reindeer, and Arctic wolves, alongside smaller animals like Arctic foxes, snow geese, and snowy owls. At the center were 3 orphan polar bears, Aurora, Nikita, and Inukshuk, who had been hand-raised at the zoo and returned to become the stars of the new exhibit.
By 2010, the Toronto Zoo was more than just about animals. It started to layer memory and meaning onto the grounds themselves. That summer, the phase of the Frank Schofield Memorial and Asian Gardens opened. Schofield was one of Toronto Zoo's early champions, someone who fought to make sure Toronto had more than just a rundown menagerie at Riverdale. The gardens, complete with a statue in his honor, were a way of saying that the zoo story was as much about people as it was polar bears. It was about the visionaries and the staff who built the place out of concrete, glass, and long hours of care. A year later, in May 2011, the zoo added new stars of its own. Black-footed penguins waddled into a renovated pool that used to belong to the South African fur seals. It was a small change on paper, but a big deal for visitors. Penguins have a way of stealing the show, and this was another chance for Toronto to showcase an endangered species while giving families something irresistible to watch. And then, in classic Toronto fashion, politics got involved. During Rob Ford's tenure as mayor, City Hall briefly floated the idea of selling the Toronto Zoo to a third party. There were headlines about private operators circling, maybe even international buyers. For a moment, it looked like one of Toronto's biggest public assets could slip away. But, like so many Ford-era firestorms, the idea eventually fizzled. The city had held onto the zoo, and life in Scarborough went back to normal.
In April 2012, the Toronto Zoo lost its accreditation with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, or AZA. Now, the AZA is not just some club. It's the gold standard for animal care in North America, setting rules on everything from enclosure design to veterinary practices to where animals can be moved. Accreditation tells the public and other institutions, this place is trustworthy. It meets the highest welfare and conservation standards. Losing it is like a university losing its accreditation. It doesn't mean the doors close, but it sends a signal to the world that something is seriously wrong. For the Toronto Zoo, that loss meant it could no longer easily participate in international breeding programs, research networks, or animal exchanges with other AZA-accredited institutions. It raised doubts about whether Toronto could still be seen as a leader in conservation, or if politics had just dragged it backward. The issue came down to elephants. At the time, Toronto still had 3: Toka, Tika, and Iringa. The zoo's professional staff recommended sending them to another accredited zoo where they could be properly cared for. But Toronto City Council didn't agree. Against the advice of experts, councillors voted to send the elephants to Paws, a sanctuary in California that wasn't AZA approved. The fallout was immediate. Accreditation gone.
The zoo reapplied in 2013 and eventually got reinstated, but not before the elephants left. On October 16, 2013, Toka, Tika, and Iringa began a 50-hour truck journey across the continent to California. It was one of the most controversial decisions in the zoo's history because it raised a bigger question. Who gets to decide what ethical looks like when you've got politics, science, and public emotion pulling in different directions? Iringa died just 2 years later at the sanctuary, and the debate still lingers as the fault line in the zoo's story. And while all that was going on, Toronto did what it always seems to do when civic moods get complicated. It lined up for pandas.
They are big and black and white, and they haven't been seen in Canada for about 20 years. The pandas are back. Toronto Zoo unveiled its panda exhibit today. The pair were flown in from China in March. And as Christina Stevens reports, a lot is riding on their furry shoulders.
A song sung to catch the attention of Urshan, a 5-year-old female giant panda.
We decided to sing it so it might have turned around.
In 2012, the federal government announced a blockbuster deal with China. 2 pandas, Urshan and Demao, would come to Toronto for 5 years, then head to Calgary for 5 years. They arrived in March 2013 to a prime ministerial welcome from Stephen Harper, and the zoo built an entire interpretive center around their exhibit. It was spectacle on a national stage. In October 2015, Urshan gave birth to Jia Panpan and Jia Weiwei as the first panda cubs ever born in Canada. Their names meant Canadian hope and Canadian joy, and for a while, that was exactly the mood in the city. Plush toys sold out, lines snaked across the zoo grounds, and Toronto got the global headlines it craves. The pandas were moved to Calgary in 2018, but the momentum stayed. Around the same time, the Eurasia section of the zoo was reimagined as Eurasia Wilds. Snow leopards got a bigger stage, and the new aviary introduced Eurasian eagle owls and stellar sea eagles. It was a reminder that the zoo could balance conservation with showmanship, even with the elephant debate looming in the background.
Ambition on rails came back in 2016 when the zoo floated the idea of replacing the old Domain ride with something out of science fiction, a magnetic levitation train, or maglev. If you're not familiar, a maglev uses powerful magnets to lift the train slightly above the track. With no wheels touching the rails, it glides almost silently and can move at very high speeds. These are the same kinds of systems you find in Japan or China, moving thousands of commuters every day at bullet train speeds. Of course, in Toronto, the plan wasn't about breaking speed records. It was about solving a familiar problem. How do you move thousands of visitors across a sprawling 700-acre zoo without making it feel like a hike through Scarborough wilderness? The original Domain ride had tried to answer that in the 1970s with its monorail. The maglev proposal was its 21st century upgrade. Faster, quieter, greener, and flashy enough to make headlines. By 2018, the plan for the maglev was not just a sketch on a napkin. A consortium that included Magna International, one of Canada's biggest auto parts manufacturers, and Lockheed Martin, a company best known for fighter jets, was on paper to build it and operate it for the first 15 years. That kind of corporate lineup made the idea sound less like a zoo project and more like something out of a science fiction pitch. The promise was simple. If the monorail once gave visitors a sense of the future, this would be the 21st century upgrade. But in Toronto, futuristic projects almost always come back to Earth. Big promises meet capital budgets, political compromises, and the reality of what a publicly funded zoo can actually afford to build. What came next was not a train, but a shutdown. On March 14, 2020, the zoo closed to visitors as the pandemic swept through the city. Only essential staff stayed on site to care for the animals. In that strange spring, a Maasai giraffe calf was born to a zoo without visitors, its first weeks unfolding in silence on empty paths. By May, the team hacked together a solution. they turned the grounds into a drive-through safari, letting people circle the exhibits from their cars. It was an odd but workable compromise. In July, the gates reopened for walkers while the car route continued until October. That was only the start, because a second closure came in November 2020 when Toronto locked down again, and a third in January 2022 during the Omicron wave. In the middle of it all, the zoo introduced a vaccine policy in October 2021, requiring staff and visitors over 12 to be fully vaccinated. Each time the zoo reopened, it was a little more frayed, carrying the scars of shutdowns and uncertainty, but it stayed functional. The animals were still there, the keepers were still working, and the institution found ways to adapt.
The 2020s have been about survival, adaptation, and memory. The pandemic tested the zoo in ways that no financial shortfall or political fight ever had. The gates closed, reopened, and closed again, as Adam said. But through all of that, the keepers stayed, the animals endured, and the institution found ways to adapt. Drive-through safaris, vaccine policies, and stop and start schedules became a part of daily life. At the same time, the zoo leaned into its original promise as a place of conservation and education. The Conservation Campus project at the entrance pointed towards a future where research and public education are stitched right into the very first steps of a zoo visit. And then, the 50th anniversary in 2024 gave Toronto a chance to look backwards as well as forward. That milestone celebration honored not just the institution, but the animals that defined it. Pepe, the Sumatran orangutan, still living and still remarkable, became a symbol of continuity, the last link to opening day. Charles, the silverback gorilla who painted canvases, inspired children, and served as the soul of the Rainforest Pavilion, was cast in bronze during the festivities. 2 months later, his death from heart failure closed a chapter. It was clinical on paper, but deeply personal for anyone who had grown up visiting him. So, here we are, from a ragtag collection of cages in Riverdale Park to a sprawling conservation center in the Rouge Valley. From chained eagles to free-ranging orangutans, from being an embarrassment in the eyes of the world to being a genuine leader in conservation science. The Toronto Zoo is a really good story about Toronto itself. Big ideas, messy execution, flashes of brilliance, and constant debates about what kind of city we want to be.
And if you step back, the zoo's history is really a series of negotiations between spectacle and science, between entertainment and ethics, between a place where kids point at animals and a place that helps prevent extinctions. It has managed to be all of those things, sometimes all at once. That tension is one of the things that makes it so interesting.
Maybe that's why Torontonians keep going back, because the zoo is one of those few places where the city's contradictions aren't hidden, they're on display. We want wonder, but we also want conscience. We want to protect nature, but we also want to package it. And the question that lingers is this: are zoos places where we learn how to live with animals, or are they just mirrors showing us how conflicted we really are?
Whether you see it as a family outing or as a flawed but vital conservation project, the Toronto Zoo has become part of the city's identity. Ambitious, conflicted, and still trying to do better.
Maybe the real story of the zoo isn't just about the animals at all. Maybe it's about us, what we demand of the wild, what we decide to protect, and what compromises we're willing to live with. Love the zoo. Adam, do you have any last messages you want to share? Any thoughts you want to share?
This is just something to add because important for my parents. For those who visited this display and saw the giraffes, some of you may remember a giraffe named Twiga, which is the Swahili word for giraffe. Not the most creative name, but it's important because that name Twiga was chosen in part by my family. The Toronto Zoo held a competition right around this time, and I don't recall how, but my mother learned what the Swahili word for giraffe was, and we put it in, and it was chosen, and my sister got a giraffe doll. I don't know if she still has it, but it was very memorable for us, and I thought it was worth mentioning.
Oh, what a lovely story. That's great. Okay, guys, that's it for the episode. If you want to reach out to us, you know where to do it. Make sure to send us an email. As always, we're taking corrections, some factoids. If you have any ideas about future episodes, please let me know. If you want to share a beautiful story about your experience at the Toronto Zoo, that would be great. Adam, where can the good people actually reach out to us? Thank you.
You can find us on email at muddy_york@outlook.com. We have feeds on Twitter at Toronto_history, Blue Sky at Muddy York, all one word, and Facebook at Muddy York History, again, all one word.
Spend my time with some friends of mine, see what an elephant do. Say hello to a polar bear, find me a kangaroo. I wanna go